Well, it's time for week 10 here for the DFS Early Look. If you were watching, you should have been. It was free. Cashing points. The Houston Texans that were touted, they all went off. Everyone from Nico, Tank, Noah Brown, and of course, CJ Stroud, the absolute monster. Free again this week is cashing points, but this is not that. This is Jake Tribbey's DFS Early Look. Jake, you always say at this point of the week, you're not looking to set your lineups. We're just looking at as much information as we have. What a week last week was.
Yeah, last week was something. I mean, it was a super gross slate. Obviously, you saw everyone who banked a tournament did so with CJ Stroud. Was happy to be all over that on cashing points. Came close myself. No huge banks, but still a solid week. Great week for subs. So yeah, excited for week 10, which at least to me is a slightly better slate. Still pretty gross in the grand scheme of things, but certainly better than week 9.
We're going to take a quick second. When we come back, we're going to look at the board and check out what is going on for week 10. Of course, diving right in, I already see CJ Stroud already pushing the numbers up. He's actually higher than the first quarterback we're going to talk about. Kind of surprising, but also not really. I don't know. DraftKings isn't the most reactionary to fantasy, but here he is, especially when you get Lamar Jackson against Cleveland. Don't love that matchup at all. Let's talk about Joe Burrow, 6,800 on DraftKings, 8,200 on Fanduel. He's one spot higher on Fanduel. Let's talk about this matchup with Joey Burr.
Yeah, so quarterback on the higher end, I think is pretty interesting this week. You could make a case for any of these guys above 6K, and probably a pretty decent case. But to me, Joe Burrow really stood out, if only because he's looked fantastic these last few weeks, and the Bengals are slinging the ball. Since 2021, he's averaged 25.9 fantasy points per game in his games with a pass rate over expectation at plus 8% or higher, and that would easily lead all slate eligible quarterbacks. The good news for this week is that Cincinnati has cleared that mark in 4 straight games. They've averaged a league high plus 16.7% pass rate over expectation over that span. So from this point forward, Burrow is in contention to finish as fantasy's quarterback 1. But the DraftKings pricing algorithm continues to unfairly ding him for his injury-plagued start to the season. He's priced at just $6,800, which is $360 cheaper than his average DraftKings salary over the final 5 weeks of the 2022 season. So he's a clear value relative to his current DK salary, but the icing on the cake here is the 46.5 total, which, we wouldn't tout on a normal week. But again, this is a fairly gross slate. There are only 4 games this week with a total over 42 on the main slate. We always want to play Burrow in high total settings, and that urge only increases on a slate with limited offensive firepower.
Does the early indications of a potential back injury just set your alarms off a little bit here? I know this is the early look, but is that concerning when you see that price, or are you not really concerned about shifting off of him if that kind of escalates?
Yeah, I mean that's the thing about the early look is we'll have to wait and see on that injury info. I mean, assuming he can get out there and practice, I really wouldn't have many worries here. The big thing with him is just mobility. I'm not necessarily sure a back would dramatically impact that unless it was a significant injury. But he looked good on Sunday night. I currently don't have many concerns.
Wonderful. Let's talk about the second quarterback. Definitely been some concerns over play more recently. It feels like the magic is kind of wearing off for some people, but this is DFS. You shake that off and you take a look at the matchup. We have to remember that it's not really a what have you done for me lately situation. And this matchup is nice for Brock Purdy, 5,700 on DraftKings. That's QB12. Great value there. Not as good a value over at FanDuel at 7,400. Kind of a large discrepancy there between the two. Let's talk Brock Purdy.
Yeah, so he's a clear DraftKings value. I mean, he's averaged 19.4 DraftKings fantasy points per game across his 15 fully healthy career starts. That's fifth best among slate eligible quarterbacks this season. So, clear value there. Of course, the recent bad games might push some people away from him, but he's so cheap that, he is going to project incredibly well on this slate. He also gets a boost from playing in one of the few games with a respectable total and a further boost from facing one of the league's premier pass funnels. I don't think a lot of people realize this, but Jacksonville has forced the second highest defensive pass rate over expectation at plus 7.8%, while ranking as the second toughest schedule adjusted matchup for opposing running backs on the ground. We know the 49ers are going to want to feed Christian McCaffrey, but in a matchup like this, they may not have much of a choice. They're probably going to have to air it out with Brock Purdy. And, that means that Purdy's going to end up being a great play, assuming the volume falls into his lap. We need Jacksonville most likely to push San Francisco in order for Purdy to hit his ceiling. If this is some sort of a blowout, it is hard to see the ceiling outcome for Purdy here. At the same time, I mean, he's just a fantastic value on this Week 10 slate. Like I said, I'd expect him to be, at least in terms of projected points per dollar, top three on the slate at just 5,700. Clearly too cheap over on DraftKings.
Entirely too cheap. And I think you're right that Jacksonville will need to push, but I don't think this is the game where they're going to be able to rely on ETN with San Francisco. I think they're going to need to push the ball. I think that's where the opportunity lies. You're right. Definitely a big shift between DraftKings and Fanduel on this one, more than I think normal when it comes to what we talk about here. Shifting gears to position groups is a player that I'm happy to see back over 20 carries. He added 6 targets. He had a phenomenal game. It's Aaron Jones. Clearly, the bell cow boy is back in Green Bay. 6,500 RB11 on DraftKings, 6,800 a better value over on FanDuel. Doing a little role reversal here this early in the week. But Jake, let's talk about Aaron Jones and his matchup against Pittsburgh.
Yeah, so we know Green Bay was playing it safe with Jones as he worked his way back from the hamstring injury. He hadn't eclipsed a 49% snap share or 14 expected fantasy points in any game this season. But as you pointed out, that changed in week 9 when he posted a 57% snap share, 52% route share, 23% target share, and 20.8 expected fantasy points. Those final 3 numbers ranked 9th, 1st, and 2nd among week 9 running backs. Crucially, Jones also handled 67% of snaps, 75% of opportunities, and 76% of backfield usage in the red zone. And it's hard to see his usage going anywhere from here but up, with A.J. Dillon averaging a pathetic 3.3 yards per carry. For Week 10, I'd expect Aaron Jones to be the focal point of Green Bay's offense in what looks like a neutral matchup. And, we can't forget Christian Watson dealing with back and chest injuries. He's looking pretty beat up. Not sure if he'll play. And, if he does, probably won't be 100%. Would think Green Bay relies on their ground game here. So Aaron Jones, especially on FanDuel, popping as a really strong value. And, unlike certain other projected values, he also has great upside. Second most games of 40 or more DraftKings points among running backs since 2019. So, whenever Aaron Jones is projecting as a good value, to me, that's sort of like a value plus because we know he can have that tournament winning ceiling as well.
There's fewer running backs in the league that you always seem to get a reasonable price on that can break a slate, and that's Aaron Jones. And Jordan Love has just been so bad that relying on Aaron Jones is probably their path to winning, and that's what you want to look for when you're getting these upper tier running backs at mid tier prices. It's really a no-brainer. Speaking of another guy here on a team that loves to run the football and is in a mid tier matchup, it's Jerome Ford for Cleveland. Phenomenal speed, great balance back. You know him well. He is 5,300 on DraftKings. That's RB19. He's 6,400 on FanDuel. Also RB19. So we're coming even across the board. Let's talk Jerome Ford in a matchup that some people might think is a kind of a bad bet.
Yeah, it's interesting because I know Scott Barrett has told me many times he doesn't think thinks Jerome Ford's a little overrated for tournaments, doesn't think he quite has the ceiling. I think you could argue that in this game, he does potentially have a tournament winning ceiling. He managed 20.3 expected fantasy points, which was the 4th best workload among all week 9 running backs. alongside the 11th best snap share, seventh best route share, and the best target share at 23% in Deshaun Watson's first full game since week 3. He's an easy value at, RB19 on both sites if we anticipate about 65% of backfield usage moving forward. And he really pops this week with the Browns implied for negative game script as 6-point underdogs to Baltimore. We can't forget that while, the Ravens on the surface might appear like a bad matchup, they actually are a top 8 schedule adjusted receiving matchup for opposing running backs. And Deshaun Watson is checking the ball down at a top 12 rate. So, if you're looking to pay down at running back this week, to me, Jerome Ford really stands out, if only because he could get there on checkdowns.
Right. And that's where you have to look past surface data, and you can do that with the Fantasy Points data suite. All the advanced data went live while the day we are recording this, which is Monday. It is the fastest, and it is truly unbelievable. It's what sets the difference in edges, especially with what we just talked about with Jerome Ford. There's our plug of the day. Let's talk some wide receivers. Probably the most, in my opinion, the most important position when setting a lineup, because there are so many options. It can be hard to identify what you want to do. You have Brandon Aiyuk here as the first one you want to talk about. 7,100 on DraftKings, wide receiver 7, 7,800 wide receiver 6 on Fanduel. Debo back at practice. This could be one of your last standalone Aiyuk games for the rest of the year. Let's talk about it.
Yeah. And honestly, I really like Aiyuk, even if Debo comes back. I mean, we know he's been nothing short of spectacular this season. Aiyuk is third in PFF receiving grades and second in yards per route run, behind only Tyreek Hill. We always want to target spectacular players in DFS, especially when they're faced with incredible matchups. I mean, we already touched on this a little bit with Brock Purdy, but Jacksonville is the second softest schedule adjusted matchup for opposing outside wide receivers. And like I noted with Purdy, they're a top 3 pass funnel by pass rate over expectation allowed. That's going to force San Francisco to get away from their ground game. They are one of the more run heavy teams in the league. It's going to force them to throw to their wide receivers, and who to throw to but Brandon Aiyuk, who's playing like one of the best wide receivers in the NFL. To me, when you look at the expensive tier of wide receivers on this slate, again, similar to the expensive quarterbacks, you can make arguments for any of these guys, but Aiyuk stands out as clearly underpriced. I mean, you could make an argument he should be 76, 7,800 on DraftKings, especially in a contest where we expect San Francisco to air the ball out.
Being cheaper than Mike Evans blows my mind. I mean, Evans has been pretty good across the board, but as you said, Aiyuk being as good as he's been all year, to be cheaper than Mike Evans and then 1,200 cheaper than Amon-Ra St. Brown. It's exactly what we're talking about in terms of values for a potential wide receiver 1 on a slate.
Yeah, absolutely. It's it seems like the ideal place to play Brandon Aiyuk, and I'd imagine, as the season moves on, by the time we get to week, 16, 17, 18, we're going to be looking at an $8,000 Aiyuk on DraftKings.
Easily. Yeah, I don't think that's a question at all. I think that's just factual. Let's talk about DeAndre Hopkins, who is getting a bit of a bump here with Huckett, Chuckett, Will Levis playing quarterback now. Gone are the days of Dusty Tannehill. Now we have somebody who can really push the ball downfield, lots of zip, and it's working with DeAndre Hopkins, even if it looks like he's running through mud every time he's running down the field. His legs look dusty. But what's not dusty is 6,000 on DraftKings, wide receiver 17. Fanduel has him as not as good a value, 7,100. He's wide receiver 10. That's a little steep for me, but let's talk DeAndre Hopkins.
Yeah, it's certainly a big gap in pricing between DraftKings and FanDuel. At the very least, it's a good sign for Hopkins' DraftKings value that he has been priced up so aggressively on FanDuel. That generally means things are trending in the right direction. He ranks 13th in fantasy points per route run, which is nothing short of miraculous, considering he was saddled with, right there at league worst levels of quarterback play prior to the arrival of Will Levis. But now, seemingly, he has a competent quarterback, and he gets a matchup which could actually force the league's most run-heavy offense to air it out. Similar to Jacksonville, Tampa Bay is a top 3 pass funnel by pass rate over expectation allowed. and they're a top 3 schedule adjusted matchup for opposing wide receivers. DeAndre Hopkins is finally getting some accurate targets. He doesn't look like the DeAndre Hopkins of old in terms of his legs, but he certainly still has the ability to go up and catch the ball, and he's seeing great volume as well. He profiles as a strong tournament option in a game where Tennessee should be forced to throw. This isn't a game we're going to want to stack, but I think if you're looking at just one-off wide receivers, DeAndre Hopkins at 6K stands out as a great value on DraftKings.
Touchdown upside definitely exists with DeAndre Hopkins and a quarterback who is not afraid to rip it. One thing Will Levis is not is cowardice. That dude just stands in there and slings it. We love that from an alpha wide receiver perspective. Let's talk about another presumed alpha. I don't really know how to feel about him right now, but his price is reflecting that of being the wide receiver 2 on the team. This is, of course, Calvin Ridley. We talked about the other players in the San Francisco matchup. This might be a nice bring back here with Calvin Ridley. 5,600 on DraftKings, wide receiver 20. Fanduel has him 6,700, wide receiver 19. So pretty even for value across the board. Let's talk about why this might be a Calvin Ridley game.
Yeah, so he's been incredibly inconsistent this year. He's only scored double-digit DraftKings points in half of his games, but he has been fairly consistent in favorable matchups. He's averaged 16 DraftKings fantasy points per game and 9.7 targets per game in his 3 games against teams that rank among the top 10 schedule-adjusted matchups for opposing outside wide receivers. San Francisco is one of those teams, and Jacksonville should be forced to throw in this contest as a 3-point underdog. This is important too. Ridley is the cheapest he's been on both sites all season. So he's really popping as a strong matchup based buy low options in one of the few games on this slate that has any offensive juice. We're really going to be concentrated, I think, in terms of our game stacks here. Calvin Ridley, I think, pops as, one of the preferred bring back options if you are stacking San Francisco.
Absolutely. He's been hard to trust, but his price reflects as somebody that you want to be investing in for the big game potential, maybe as a throwback Ridley game this week. Like you said, if San Francisco's line is going to hit, we need someone on Jacksonville to do it. And per price, Calvin Ridley looks like he's lining up to be that guy. Somebody who personally victimized me all weekend because I just did not play enough of him. Is Dalton Schultz. I came up short in so many of my lineups and season longs because I got Schultz. We're talking about him today. We're not doing a Cardinals tight end this week, but we are going to do a Texans. This is Dalton Schultz, 4,900 on DraftKings, 6,100 on FanDuel. Good for tight end 6 on both platforms. He is just blown up as Stroud has gotten better. Let's talk Schultz and whether or not we think it can keep up.
Yeah, so Schultz is averaging 8.3 targets per game, 65 receiving yards per game, and 16.7 DraftKings fantasy points per game over his last 4 games. Among slate-eligible tight ends this year, those marks rank second, first, and first. Yet he's priced as the tight end 6 on both sites. He's been nothing short of a high-end tight end 1 over the last month, while sneakily leading all tight ends with 8 end zone targets over the full season. That's as many as Travis Kelce and George Kittle have combined. I really wouldn't expect Schultz's volume to slow down anytime soon after recent comments by Houston head coach DeMeco Ryans suggested that the Texans are going to have to continue throwing the ball as long as the run game remains inefficient. And I wouldn't expect run game efficiency to improve this week against the Bengals, who are a bottom 10 schedule adjusted matchup for opposing running backs on the ground, but the single softest schedule adjusted matchup for opposing tight ends. We're going to want to get aggressive with game stacks this week, given the lack of compelling scoring environments. And Schultz is the perfect way to get Mark Andrews levels of volume in a premier game for a mid-range tight end 1 salary. I mean, he's $2,000 cheaper than Andrews on DraftKings. It's just a ridiculous value on Schultz if we think this volume continues, which in this matchup, I don't see why it wouldn't.
Again, we talked about Burrow at the very beginning, and we talked a couple weeks back, if you remember, on how to get that elite bring back without hitting a different position. This is how you can do that. You can get a Burrow Chase stack with an elite option bring back at a reasonable price with Schultz. And that's just the easiest way to get that bring back when you have a matchup like that. He is legitimately able to break the slate from the tight end position. And like you said, he's the tight end 6. It's just everything's lining up for him.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this is, like I said, there's going to be a few games that we want to get really concentrated on. If you're stacking, the Texans Bengals game, probably not playing a ton of Irv Smith. Time to load up on Dalton Schultz.
Yeah, Irv Smith without that touchdown this week, just no. Someone played him out there, and they might have benefited, and makes me sick a little bit. No Irv Smith talk, little Irv Smith talk as we can get through on this show forever. Jake, phenomenal. I always love the early look. It really lets us just get a quick glimpse. It is the earliest anyone will get DFS content in the business. We're number 1, so we wear that proudly. Article comes out tomorrow when we're recording this.
Yeah. The article will be out Tuesday by noon, and then I'll have DFS study hall out on Thursday. We'll have DFS values out on Friday. Scott Barrett's big slate breakdown comes out Saturday morning, and then of course we'll have cashing points for free on the Fantasy Points YouTube channel Friday evening at 7 p.m. Eastern.
The hottest DFS show out there. Look, we'll be back here next week for another DFS early look. I can't wait. Good luck heading into week 10.